you know why that is. No secret there. First, I want to just tell you I'm Dee Ruggles. I'm the director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory. And as always, we'll begin with a land acknowledgement, and then I'll make some announcements, and then I'll introduce our speakers. I'd like to begin by reminding us that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascouten, Ottawa, South Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations, lands that were the traditional territory of Native nations prior to their forced removal. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. There are chairs up here. In light of this, we must strive to become a vibrant community, inclusive of all our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our effort. A few announcements. Next week, we have critical race theory with two of our colleagues, Eddie O'Byrne and Emma Bellis. And again, we will stage it as both a lecture and a kind of dialogue between them to see if we can kind of enter into the subject not as a monolith, but as something that is itself vibrant. I also want to tell you about a symposium that is coming up, organized by Jamie Keener of the Unit for Criticism. It's called Theorizing Pre-Modern Alterity and Racial Rhetorics. It's like the most academic title we could possibly come up with. But it's going to be very, very interesting, and it's everything from sort of late classical to European medieval to Islamic medieval. And I personally am excited about it. It's November 8th, and it will be in the Illini Union. And then, although it's a little early to be announcing this, but I want you to know that in March, I think it's March 7th and 8th, the spring conference will be on the theme of protest and civil disobedience, which to me seems like a very, very timely and important topic for us to be considering in light of what happened last spring, and frankly, ongoing dissatisfaction with the way the world is. So, having said that, and hoping you'll put that on your calendars and come to those two events, I have the great pleasure of introducing, where did he go? Typical Behrooz, slipped out the back door. Introducing Behrooz Ghamari-Tabrizi, speaking to us today on the topic of Foucault. Professor Ghamari-Tabrizi is well known to many of us because he was on the faculty here for 13 years, with an appointment in history and sociology, also a zero-time appointment in the unit. And for part of that time, you served as director of the Center for Middle East and South Asian Studies, which landed you a similar position at Princeton in 2019, where he moved to the Department of Near Eastern Studies. And do you still direct the center?
Yes.
And directed and now still directs the Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. He's the author of 3 books on different aspects and historical contexts of the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and its aftermath. They are, in 2008, Islam and Dissent in Post-Revolutionary Iran, Abdul Karim Saroush and the Religious Foundations of Political Reform. In 2016, he wrote Foucault in Iran, Islamic Revolution After the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment. That was a contemporary twist on that. And then also his third book, which many of us actually hold very dear because it was issued in the form of serial chapters, much the way Dickens issued his chapters. And you would send that on, is it New Year's Eve, each chapter, and then collected them into a book called Remembering Akbar Inside the Iranian Revolution, literally inside the prisons of the Iranian Revolution. So with that, please join me in welcoming our friend and former colleague, Behrooz.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be back in Paris. And it's so cold here. So, first of all, Didi, thank you so much for the invitation. Shelley, for all your work. Ty, where are you? He's out, and thank you so much. And directing a center, I know that how difficult and complicated it is to organize an event. and often people who do the real work are behind the scenes. Oh. You want louder? Louder than this would be the voice of God, you know. One wishes, you know. So thanks to all of you, and all of you who are here, many familiar faces and some new friends, and hopefully we can get the chance to talk a little bit after the talk.
Oh, I have to say something. Sorry to interrupt, but tomorrow there is an opportunity. Actually, tomorrow from 12 to 1:30, particularly for graduate students, but actually faculty are welcome too. We're going to have just a platter of sandwiches. You know, I'm very informal. I don't do things at this level. I always do them at this level. So just a platter of sandwiches, cookies, coffee available in the unit offices for a kind of meet and greet with you.
Is it?
Yeah, that's right. That's what you're doing.
Thank you for letting me know. No, I knew it. Nothing is free. So I also heard that there is a strike going on here on campus. It's over? Yes? They won? Some things. I just wanted to acknowledge that because I was reading about it, and of course these are hard times. Many of us have been preoccupied with the war in Palestine and the spreading of the war and all the sort of atrocities that are unfolding. And so I thought that this might be the only occasion in your professional life that talking about Foucault would be sort of decompressing, you know. So take that as a event for decompressing about what's happening around us. This is also a difficult talk because how do you talk about a person who is so influential and has really shaped so many disciplines in academia and also outside academia, about the way we see the world, about the way we participate in the world, the way we make sense of the world, and even in very unlikely places, as my book on Foucault in Iran indicates, that you find the footprint of his ideas in likely and unlikely places. So I thought that I'm going to give a very general introduction, and beforehand I apologize to those of you who know Foucault much better than I do, and it's going to be a little bit boring, but I thought that possibly some of you have not studied Foucault very carefully, and you might find some interesting points that you want to pursue and dig in a little bit further. Some biographical information, and I think that helps a little bit to situate Foucault in his time. In one of his interviews, how much time do I have? 2 hours? You all have brought your dinner, right? With you. In one of his, he never talked about himself that much. There are a lot of anecdotal things here and there that we can sort of put together about his life. And one of the things that I like about the way he talks about his life is that he always, in a couple of places, he said that the earliest memory he has, that was not Foucault calling, is the Spanish Civil War and the Italian-Ethiopian campaign and the war. And I think that's a sort of an interesting thing for him to highlight in his own narrative about himself, that the Spanish Civil War and Ethiopian War were the two sort of defining moments for him as a child, And by no means he was a brilliant student. He was kind of sort of C average kind of student. And he failed the entrance exam to École Normale in 1945. But by that time, he's in Paris. He makes friends with Jean-Paul Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. And as some of you know, Foucault and Sartre did not see eye to eye, but their friendship went way back, as Foucault was very young and was inspired by Sartre, but that friendship continued despite their disagreements in their works. He studied Freud and Nietzsche very carefully, and after studying Freud and Nietzsche, he started studying Marx. Sort of, unusual for French intellectuals not to start from Marx. Just like he was sort of a latecomer to Marx and a very latecomer to sort of a left politics in France. And he became friends with Louis Althusser, who had a profound effect on Foucault, though Foucault does not acknowledge that a lot. I mean, Foucault doesn't acknowledge much about, that. And it's also interesting that in his own work, when you read his own work, he doesn't acknowledge his own work as well. I mean, he's sort of seldom you see Foucault saying that, as I argued in my X book, he would never say that, and as if nothing existed before this one, So, but Althusser, and as I explained a little bit his ideas, for those of you who are familiar with Althusser's work, you see Althusser's influence on Foucault, and a little bit Gramsci's influence via Althusser on Foucault. And he studied with Althusser France. I mean, I have colleagues here who know French scene pretty well. It's a very kind of patrimonial system. If you make friends with Althusser and then they let you take classes at École Normale, and he did that, and then Althusser was his teacher, and then he got a position in École Normale as a sort of adjunct lecturer or something like that, to translate to our kind of vocabulary here. It's during that time that that he becomes conscious of his own homosexuality, and I thought that this passage here would be a very interesting and telling of that moment for him, where he says, in 1950 and throughout the 10 or 15 that followed, the books I accumulated concerned only trauma, neurosis, natural inferiority, misery as a calling. That this was the age of psychiatry and psychoanalysis. Medical doctors, successors to the priest and the police, now rendered sentences on the homosexual condition, and were even more highly valued because they came from an apparently scientific authority and emanated a certain paternal benevolence. Each time a psychoanalyst wrote, "I never met a happy homosexual," I took this judgment to be a truth beyond doubt and huddled deeper into the consciousness of my woes. That really captures a lot of his scholarship after this moment. And again, you can you can see that if I could, okay, that how out of sync he was with the intellectual scene in France in 1950s and early 1960s. In 1950, just to the desire to be the part of the crowd, he joined the French Communist Party. So this is, I mean, you need to realize that this is the time that everybody is leaving the French Communist Party. And he's always late to the party, you know. Both party and party, you know. When he was in San Francisco, he had a reputation for being late for the party, you know. But that party, that kind of, good kind of party. And I think, you know, the joining of to the Communist Party was mostly under the influence and authority of Hélène Rittmann, Althusser's wife. Althusser's wife was a very, very militant communist part of the resistance movement during the war, and was very much influential over Althusser, and then via that, I mean, sort of opened that door to Foucault's membership in Communist Party, and but that didn't last long, because after Stalin's death in 1953, there's a little anecdote that how many of you know Serge Prokofiev, the Russian composer? Very few people know. I mean, there's a reason that very few people know him, because Prokofiev died the same day Stalin died, and for many years, no one knew that Prokofiev was dead. So if you want to die, don't die on the same day of a very, very, very important person in history. But, you know, and also you know that the story is about the Jewish doctor plots to kill Stalin, and so it's only after those kind of very overt anti-Semitism. At that time, anti-Semitism, I think, had a rather different kind of meaning than today, that is very much instrumentalized in so many wrong ways, I think. But that's sort of an overt anti-Semitism of the Communist Party, and also very anti-gay and homosexual news from the Soviet Union at the time. So he left. He left the Communist Party, and from there in 1954. Why doesn't everyone use Mac? He got a job as a cultural attaché of French embassy in Sweden. And while he was in Sweden, he thought, well, why not? I go get a PhD at a lesser university in Uppsala. You know? So he went there. Of course, Uppsala is one of the oldest universities in Europe, very, very important university. And I think they were offended that Foucault thought it was very easy to get a PhD at Uppsala. And he submitted his thesis in 1957, and he failed the exam. And so they kicked him out of the university without a PhD. They're still sort of rethinking that in Uppsala, you know. And so denied Foucault's PhD thesis, you know. And of course, that thesis was Madness and Civilization, which became such an important book, you know. So he travels around and to Poland, to Germany, some teaching gigs here and there, and he also had a lot of hair at that time, and then goes back to Paris, and in 1961 gets his PhD from University of Paris, and then he starts writing his major works. The first, of course, the dissertation, and then the birth of the clinic in 1963, and then he goes to Brazil from there. There's a really nice interview with Foucault, and the interviewer asks him, "So what was your reading list?" He said that, "I never had a reading list. Whatever I could find, I read, And I think that one of the other things was that, wherever he could go, he'll go, And so he traveled quite a bit. And I think that traveling also is kind of manifested in his writings. And 65, he goes to Brazil, and then from Brazil he goes to Tunisia, and in Tunisia he works on one of his major works, The Archaeology of Knowledge, which was published the same year in 1966. And then he returns to Paris in 1968. A lot of people criticized him for not being a part of the 68 movement in Paris, but he sort of arrives at the tail end of this. Again, he was late, and it's definitely a theme in his work. And then he became very much closely involved in the movement of prisoners' rights, beginning in 71, and later when I tell you a little bit about the Iranian adventure, it's through his work with prisoners' rights that he was connected to the Iranian scene in France. And 1975, his book, Discipline and Punish, which is possibly the most read book of Foucault, and a year later, History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and then he goes to Iran, and then Poland, and dies. Of course, he spent time in Berkeley and San Francisco in between, and he died in 1984 of complications from AIDS-related illnesses. This is also a very interesting, that is sort of a bridge between early Foucault and then Foucault, who becomes more thoughtful about his sort of philosophical turn. I think that before 1968, at least in France, you had to be a philosopher, a Marxist, or a phenomenologist, or a structuralist, and I adhered to none of these dogmas. The second point is that at this time in France, studying psychiatry or the history of medicine had no real status in the political field. Nobody was interested in that. The first thing that happened after 1968 was that Marxism as a dogmatic framework declined, and new political, cultural interests concerning personal life appeared. That's why I think my work had nearly no echo, with the exception of a very small circle before 1968. So there is a lot of literature on, on this sort of post-68 sort of neo-Marxism, post-Marxism, and the sort of the ideology of defeat, basically. And this is sort of the moment that Foucault emerges into the scene in France particularly, and even so that his work became known, he thought that the moment that he became an important figure was when his work was translated into English. And again, in one of these anecdotes, he said that, that he thought that his work in English made more sense. And sorry. Sorry. So, of course, it's not only the fact that his work in English made more sense, it's about capitalism, that once you are translated into English, there's a whole network that is at work that to introduce and distribute your work, and then, if you are an important philosopher in France, then you become doubly important if you are re-imported from the US back to France. It's really about capitalism, I think, but that's a whole different sort of can of worms there. So there are 4 periods. Whenever you're getting bored, let me know, so I can sing a song or something. There are 4 periods in Foucault's work that starts first with Madness and Civilization in 1961, that he makes this incredible intervention. If you haven't read this book, I really highly suggest that to sort of have a quick read of this book, where he sort of tries to show how madness is transformed from a divinely inspired thought into a mental illness. And there's a whole, if you look around different traditions from the East, from the West, from the time of Plato to all these sort of writings of Sufis in South Asia, in Africa, there's a whole long tradition of madness as something divinely inspired, because mad people basically easily transgress the boundaries of language, and interaction. So he sort of delves into the sort of transformation of madness from that kind of divinely inspired thought into a mental illness. The second period, the order of things, and the archaeology of knowledge, where he sort of advances his theory, his archaeological take on the development of scientific knowledge, and how the language of science, as it was developed in the post-classical time, created a system of linguistic structures that inhibited and restricted the way we can talk about ourselves and the outside world. If you want to read any of Foucault's works, I say that don't start from the order of things. It's a very, very dense book, and so is the archaeology of knowledge. But that's the second period. So the third period is Discipline and Punish and History of Sexuality, Volume 1. The reason I emphasize Volume 1 becomes clear later, why I keep saying Volume 1. That these 2 books are basically the places that Foucault develops his theory of power and what is known as the microphysics of power, and how power operates in society. I'll talk about all these things in a bit. So, and the fourth period, which is the last 4 or 5 years of his life, the period of problematization, or the question of the subject. In the second volume of History of Sexuality, called The Care of the Self. And then the series of other books that he writes in the past. He was extremely productive in the last 4 years of his life. And in my opinion, possibly the best works he produced are in those last 4 years of his life. So if you decide to read anything by Foucault, just start from the end. You know? So, how to make sense of Foucault? It's truly a, how much is a $60,000 question, or 60,000 or $60 million? Yeah, 64 million dollar question. We have to count for inflation. You know. How to make sense of Foucault is a very, very complicated question. And I thought that, you know, I sort of take a page from this short piece by Isaiah Berlin, the hedgehog and the fox, that to see which one is Foucault. The little piece that Isaiah Berlin wrote, these are one of those sort of funny things that happens in history. Like, he said that, you know, he was trying to be playful, and he wrote this little thing about hedgehog and fox, and the difference he wanted to make argument that and the piece is basically about Tolstoy, you know, that there are two different kinds of intellectuals in the world. One kind of intellectuals are like hedgehog. These are people who dig a really deep hole and go down and look at the world from that little hole. And they can explain everything in the world through looking that hole to the rest of the world, you know. Like in the olden days, you know, when we were Marxist-Leninists, you know, we were a hedgehog, very clearly a hedgehog. We could explain everything in the world with the logic of class struggle, you know, and or mode of production. You know, that's sort of a very sort of broad understanding of the world, and you have a key element there, a key window. You open that window, you see the entire world. So the fox is constantly jumping around, you know, from one place to another place. Fox finds something interesting here. There's some chicken over there. Goes play and eat the chicken, you know, and has no claim to have a coherent system of seeing the world. And I always thought that it's so hard to pin Foucault between these two, you know. A lot of people, like if you look at the Cambridge company, Foucault, what is that series that Cambridge publishes? A company, Foucault, Cambridge company, huh? Companion. Yeah. I'm getting hungry. You know. Cambridge. The whole premise of that volume is that Foucault was a fox. So you don't need to really go around and try to figure out a coherent system of seeing the world. He had some ideas about sexuality. He has some ideas about power. He has some ideas about discursive practice. He has some ideas about this and that. And then, you know, you read them, you learn from them, but that not necessarily give you a particular way to understand the world. I don't know which one of these is Foucault. I mean, I think he's sort of, that's why I put them in the middle of the two. But one of the things that possibly after our conversation, we have some clarity there. One of the ways that we can understand the significance of Foucault is to look at the controversies. Two important parts of Foucault's philosophical interventions. Some people say that Foucault was a historical philosopher. Some people say that he is a philosopher of history. Right? But in any case, two important parts of his epistemological intervention is the question of archaeology, of knowledge, and genealogical method. Both of these dimensions of Foucault's intervention are there to sort of question the coherence of the subject, that the subject is an individual, an entity that, that sees the world and interprets the world and makes sense of the world outside the sort of what he calls the linguistic structures. The linguistic structures always already are there before that subject can make sense of the world. In that sense, although Foucault is always understood as a post-structuralist philosopher, he's deeply structuralist in that. And if any of you after this talk are persuaded to dig deeper into this thing, if you want to understand the difference between structuralism and post-structuralism, it's really good to read Foucault, and you see that kind of transformation from a very deeply structuralist understanding of the subject, which is the very Althusserian influence on him, to a very kind of what I say, the revival of the subject in his writings, in his later writing. But in both cases, he does that to say that history, neither history in his genealogical method, nor the subject in his archaeological method have any inherent meaning. The meaning, there is no teleology in history. There are a series of things, that contingent things that happens. And the fact that we face a particular moment in our lives is the result of series of contingencies that without any direction, without any particular form of inherent logic. There, of course, he is sort of advancing a critique of Hegelian Marxism. And then, the other side of his argument is about power and discourse. Both of these has raised questions about the question of the subject. He's been criticized mostly from feminist scholarship that if history is happening on its own, and there are structures of power and discourse in society, and they both had some presence outside and beyond any form of subject, then what are we left with? How is it possible to make any intervention in the world without saying that you are basically reproducing the same world? Because as I said, if whatever you say is a reflection of those linguistic structures that already exist, then there is no way that you can find a moment of emancipation, so-called emancipation, to go beyond the already existing conditions. Let me explain this a little bit more. Have I already talked for 50 minutes? I know I'm good, but have I talked for 50 minutes? Sorry, I got too involved in this. So, in archaeology, he says that every era, every time in history, there is something called, he calls it the episteme. Episteme basically is the sort of the limits and horizons that are available to us in terms of what we can actually say. Above and beyond those horizons, there are all those things unsayable. And in archaeology, that he follows is a sort of history of concepts and ideas. He borrows from his teacher, Georges Canguilhem. But he says that, it's not, we don't want to look at the history of concepts. We want to study how concepts are situated within particular structures of language. Here he is so similar to Saussure. He sort of says that, the way we understand the world is that constantly we move from a position of passivity. Because there are always things, he said, Saussure says that there is a difference between language and speech, right? And speech, when we speak, that kind of speech already presupposes the language. And here, Foucault says that whatever thoughts we have presupposes already a system of thoughts and discourses and languages that makes that available to us. So in that sense, it's a very deeply structuralist approach in the history of thought. And basically, what he says about archaeology is that it's a search for a set of rules that determine the conditions of possibility of all that can be said within a particular discourse at any given time. And these times are sort of, whatever we say, it's a little bit complicated here, just bear with me. Whatever we say is communicated during the process of articulation. He calls that discursive practice. That also comes from a very Gramscian, Althussergian notion that if you're familiar with Gramsci, for example, that he has this critique of class consciousness, that as if class consciousness, he says, Gramsci says, as if class consciousness is something that you inherit, while actually class consciousness is not something that you inherit. Class consciousness is something that you practice. And in the process of practicing, I mean, of course, here you see Judith Butler, you see Gramsci, you see Judith Butler, because it's very performative, right? And Foucault has this idea about these kind of discursive practices that once you practice this, it's regular and unconscious. It's part of your unconscious. And if you want to sort of make these kind of connections, you can also go to Bourdieu's notion of doxa, that sort of, it exists without any kind of challenges. Again, if they are not clear, then we can have a conversation afterwards. In genealogy, if I can, I don't know what happened here. This was late, It's very Foucauldian, late, That line I wanted to have there, because that's the last line of Order of Things, like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. This is about the subject, The subject appears and disappears, like a face drawn on the sand. And again, you can think of Barthes, you can think of a lot of other sort of semiotic structuralists who have the same kind of idea that the subject is very, very unstable. The subject does not have that kind of liberal coherence that moves through time, And in genealogy also, he basically calls that history of the present. He basically said there is no history. I mean, you're familiar with the famous Collingwood, my historian colleagues here, that all history is the history of the present. Foucault has a little bit of a twist there, that he says that there is no history, and the only order in history is created by the historian. The only order in history is created by the historian. That's why we get the big checks, like the historian. And why does he do that? He says that, in order to show the surpassability of the current condition, you need to understand the time genealogically. Surpassability is a word in English? Yes? David, is it a word? Can we use that? Yeah, good. Because then, why is this so important? Because if we understand the current moment as a history of if you understand history as the history of the present, then we are rejecting the idea of necessity and inevitability. He wants to say that there is nothing inevitable about the conditions we live under today, right? And if this is not inevitable, then it is surpassable. And he says that there are all these micro-causal relations that happens that makes the, sorry. What's in this water? So, if you're Hegelian and you think about the concept of freedom, freedom in Hegel is the realization of necessity, And here he's mostly arguing against Marxists, but also against liberals, liberal philosophy, that the people who think about the end of history, that Therefore, he says that, none of these categories we deal with, and that's why Foucault is so important in gender studies. None of these categories that we deal with today are inevitable classifications or categories, from gender to class, to race, to whatever categories we have that through which we understand society. None of these are categories that are the result of the unfolding of an internal logic of history. And there's no necessity in them. There are a lot of contingencies that has shaped the current condition, and with the same kind of understanding, we can surpass these conditions. So the fact that, for example, he asks in history of in Madness and Civilization that was there anything inevitable in creating asylums to put the insane in those places? Was there anything inevitable to have medicine the way we have hospitals, we have these institutions that separates people, the patient, from the rest of the population? Was there anything inevitable to have institutions of education the way they are set up today, and that we understand them the way they are? Was there anything inevitable that we organize our economy the way we organize our economy under capitalism? Was capitalism inevitable itself? And of course, again, if you're coming from that kind of Marxist framework, that's pretty sacrilegious, of course, to say that was capitalism inevitable in human history. But this is what his genealogy, what he borrows from Nietzsche, of course, that he wants to do in a Nietzschean word, an effective history. History that is shaped and informed and conditioned by a current intervention. An effective history. Nietzsche calls that effective history. So let me skip this because I talked about history of sexuality already, but I want to just highlight this to say that when he brings his genealogy and archaeology together, he presents a picture of the formation. Here he calls it fabrication, but he later on he sort of resents that conception of fabrication. How individuals are constructed as knowing, knowable, and self-knowing being. All subjects go through these three different levels of processes. And through these processes, we become the subjects of modern societies, to be knowing, knowable, and self-knowing being. And he says that, in history, these formations have come into being first by exclusion, because you create societies that are part of the society is unwanted, and first by taboos, and the people who are excluded are called the outcast, then by law, and people who are excluded are called criminals, and then by discourse, who are excluded are called the abnormal. And he says that the same thing about Madness and Civilization. I don't want to get into that, but let me just go through this a little bit. This is a little bit of a very sort of dense slide here. So subjectivity becomes both the product and source of knowledge and power through 4 distinct operations. This is very important. Subjectivity as the source and outcome of knowledge and power. The first thing that is done in post-classical time is dividing practices. How psychiatry divides mad from the sane. 2 books, Madness, this is kind of a conclusion there. Madness and Civilization, Birth of the Clinic. Scientific classifications, how science classifies the individual as the subject of life in biology, labor in economics, and language in linguistics. 2 important books, The Order of Things and Archaeology of Human Sciences. Subjectification, the way the individuals turn his or herself into subject of health, sexuality, and manners. The books, Discipline and Punish, and History of Sexuality. The most important instrument, I thought, of subjectification is Google Watch. My sister gave me a Google Watch against her better judgment. And I wore this watch, and I realized that now I'm totally captive to this watch, because I'm walking, the watch says you're walking wrong. I'm breathing, your breathing is too fast. I'm sleeping, oh, you stop breathing, wake up, So like, what is this? So I just threw the watch out. I said, I'm enough topic of subjectification myself every day. I don't need Google Watch to remind me every second of the day that you are just a slave to this little watch here. And then problematization, sort of the last works of Foucault, which is hermeneutics of the subject, spirituality, and care of the self. And History of Sexuality, Volume 2 and 3, and the hermeneutics of the subject, which was a series of lectures. Okay. And I say this, let me just move fast here, because I'm really way over time here. I'm not going to say anything here. I talk about this if you ask questions about this. The last period of Foucault's work on the realms of possibility, a theory of subject. As I said, a lot of the critique of Foucault's work was exactly about the question of the subject. So what happens? Are we all doomed in this world? Are we all kind of cogs in this machine that we can never sort of find a way out of this existence to experience any kind of alternative modes of life? And for those of you who are sociologists and you study Max Weber, Foucault was also very much influenced by Max Weber. Again, like usual, he never acknowledges that. But there's an interesting twist in his theory of power, because in Max Weber, when Max Weber talks about power and domination, he says that there is a distinction between the two. In power, Power means the ability of a person or an institution to carry out its demands with or without resistance. So it's very kind of one-directional. Domination, by contrast, is based on consent. Two sides of a relationship participate willingly in a relationship of power because both sides believe that they would gain something by participating in this relationship. How many of you are students here? Excellent. So you're all subject of domination here, right? But has anybody forced you to come here tonight? No. I mean, some professors force students to do things, but that's not cool. Has anybody forced you to go and get a PhD? No. Why do you do it? You enter a relationship of domination at the university with the administration, with the professors. Why? Because you deeply believe that there is something in it for you, right? Because you gain something. And this is a relationship of power based on consent. A relationship of power when both sides are willingly participating in it because both sides think that they're going to gain something. So that's Weber's definition. Foucault turns this around. Foucault says all relations of power are relations of domination. Right? All relations of, because every single person, every subject in society participates in their social life, in their social world, because they believe that they are gaining something. And he says that we should stop thinking about power in pejorative, negative terms. Power is productive. And we all witness to that because you enter this relationship of power because it's productive for you. You're taking notes, right? Okay, very good. It's very, very productive, hopefully, you know. And but this is the entire sort of relationship in society. Capitalism is, you know, about relations of power. You know, I come here because they told me that they are going to give me some money to come here. You know, of course, you know, if you are purely instrumental, you say that I do this. You know, like 99.99% of people under capitalism are doing what they do because of some instrumental reason, right? And that's Marx's alienation, right? And the whole sort of capitalist system that is based on this kind of Weberian instrumental rationality, right? That we do things not because we are so dying to do that thing, because we think that at the end of the day, we gain something. We work in a factory because we get paid at the end of the month, you know, and in an office, you know. So we are a student, we are all these things. So when Foucault says that power is productive, he's not sort of having a romantic understanding of power. He's just saying that that's the reason people willingly participate in these relations of power in society. And so if that is the case, then where is the source of resistance? If in sort of older form, again, you know, because a lot of this about Marxism, if you think that there is an oppressor and there is an oppressed, and the oppressed wants to decapitate the oppressor, right? I mean, these days we shouldn't use decapitation, but hey. But if you turn that around and say that actually the oppressor is not up there, the oppressor is in here, right? Because you have entered a relationship at the micro levels of your body, at the cellular levels of your body, that you're constantly resubjugating yourself. In order to function in this society, you have to perpetually resubjugate yourself to be a part of this society. So power is not a commodity out there that somebody is possessing. Power is something that is constantly, perpetually being produced by your participation in social acts. Again, okay, very scary picture, right? And it creates a lot of ethical, moral anxieties. That how can we live in this society like that, that we are our own oppressors, you know? And so the last part of Foucault's writings, The Realm of Possibilities, a Theory of Subject, comes from his writings on the Iranian Revolution. I think something very important sort of clicked and changed in him with witnessing the Iranian Revolution. This is 1978. This is Foucault in Tehran, at the Tehran airport, waiting for his luggage. The luggage is late, but he's sort of having a conversation at the airport. I have a lot of stories because I sort of read a lot of things about that. But I wanted to show you something that is a little bit disturbing, but this is, Foucault arrived in Tehran a week after September massacre in Tehran, that in the Iranian historiography of the revolution is known as the Black Friday, that the government declared martial law, and people didn't know that martial law was declared, and they were demonstrating, and they come to this major square in east of Tehran and see soldiers there, and the soldiers warned them. Everyone thought that, okay, they're just warning, you know. And then they started shooting people, and there's a huge massacre. At the time, the rumor was more than 4,000 people were killed. In reality, around 80 people were killed. But who cares for reality? 4,000 people killed was the rumor, and that's how it got sort of appropriated and operationalized in the revolutionary machine. And Foucault arrived just a week after this scene. And he says when he arrived in Tehran that he thought that he's going to go and see a city invaded by fear. And he goes there and he says that there was no sign of fear. And he starts thinking that, so, like, what exactly is going on here? That if people believe 4,000 people were killed, and they're still out there and continuing the revolution, the protest, something must have been happening. Something has sort of was unhinged. Something was changed. And he called that thing that was changed a political spirituality. A lot of people who wrote on Foucault and Iranian Revolution mistook that spirituality as Foucault's endorsement of religion. While when he explains what he means by spirituality, it actually doesn't have anything to do with religion. He wrote about political spirituality in earlier times, and he says that there, he has this beautiful piece. He says that in France, we had this concept called the general will. the Rousseauian, yeah, the general will. And he said that in France, everybody talks about general will, but nobody has ever seen general will. And general will was like God. It was always there, and nobody knew. And he said that on the streets of Tehran, suddenly I saw the general will of a nation, you know. And, and he says that, you know, that basically, I'm done. That moment made him think that there are times in people's lives that people can transform themselves and liberate their bodies from fear, and to become subjects that they never could imagine they could become. Right? They become subjects that they could never imagine they could become. And he said that that's the lesson that you learn from this revolution. That, and that's where the source of subject is, you know. And he says that, but this is the last thing. In 1977, he says, when I think back now, I ask myself, what else was I talking about in The History of Madness, Birth of the Clinic, but power? By 1982, he's saying, it is not power, but the subject, which is the general theme of my research. And I that note.